actions now resurface. They didn't miss the warning. They didn't misunderstand the risk. They chose to ignore it, and that single decision detonated a chain reaction that ripped through the British monarchy like a slow burning fuse. This is not hindsight. This is not rumors stitched together after the damage was done. This is about what MI5 already knew, what was formally written down, and what was deliberately buried before the world was sold a glossy fairy tale. Because once you understand what sat inside that sealed file, nothing about what followed looks accidental ever again. There are names that vanished for a reason. Names tied to locked corridors and conversations that never happen on record. Ghislaine Maxwell is one of those names. And when a figure like that re-enters the frame, not as history, but as connective tissue to a future that already happened, the entire story shifts. Suddenly, this isn't about love or destiny, it's about foreknowledge. By October 2016, deep inside Britain's domestic intelligence system, a briefing was completed that the public was never meant to see. It didn't come from tabloids, it didn't come from palace whispers, it came from the very unit tasked with protecting the royal household itself. The trigger was automatic. Prince Harry had entered a confirmed romantic relationship with an American actress, and the speed alone set off alarms. 3 meetings in 8 weeks, 1 overseas. That was enough to activate a standing protocol that required vetting of any foreign national moving close to the crown. No exceptions, no sentiment, just procedure. What emerged wasn't routine, it wasn't gentle, it wasn't cautious, it was a warning. The file was classified at an internal level so restricted it was meant for only a handful of eyes. The Queen, the Prime Minister, the Home Secretary, and the Director General of MI5. From the opening pages, the tone was blunt. This was not a background check. It was a risk assessment, and the risk was labeled Category Red. In intelligence terms, Category Red doesn't mean problematic, it doesn't mean difficult. It means high risk, with the potential to cause damage that spreads outward and cannot be contained. The assessment stated plainly that, left unmitigated, Meghan Markle carried the capacity to inflict strategic-level reputational damage to the monarchy within 36 to 60 months, not decades, months. The recommendation was equally direct: she should not be cleared for formal integration into the royal family. This wasn't about kindness, it wasn't about love. Intelligence services don't measure feelings, they measure patterns. And the pattern they saw was one they recognized far too well. The file moved into psychology. Years before meeting Prince Harry, Meghan Markle had consulted a psychiatric practice in Los Angeles. That information fed into a covert psychological profile commissioned during vetting. The conclusions were clinical, unemotional, and stark, pronounced cluster B traits with elevated narcissistic and histrionic features. But the label wasn't the headline. The cycle was. Again and again, her relationships followed the same arc: idealize, devalue, discard. Friends, partners, professional circles. The endings weren't quiet. They were abrupt, explosive, and often triggered by perceived slights. Analysts flagged an intense need for validation paired with extreme sensitivity to criticism, an engine built for escalation once admiration faded. Then the file turned to money, not wealth, not success, but opacity. Offshore structures, redactions. In 2013, an entity incorporated in the British Virgin Islands began receiving residual and endorsement income. Legal on paper, but visibility blocking by design. In March 2016, a $450,000 cash deposit appeared in a Toronto account linked to Meghan Markle. The source was unknown. Canadian authorities flagged it. A financial crimes file was opened, and then, without explanation, it was closed after a single phone call from the U.S. Embassy press attached. No source identified. No transparency restored. For MI5, this wasn't proof of wrongdoing, it was proof of intervention. And intervention without explanation is its own risk category. The lens widened. Intelligence never looks at individuals alone. It looks at access. Gatekeepers. Rooms where introductions happen quietly. The file documented repeated attendance at tightly curated private gatherings tied to Soho House. Spaces where culture, politics, and influence cross paths under lifestyle branding. These weren't mixers, they were exchanges. Sustained correspondence with figures whose family ties intersected with development organizations receiving pass-through funding was noted. Again, not accusation, alignment. And alignment, when it repeats, stops looking random. Control of narrative came next. Between 2013 and 2015, dozens of aged social media accounts were quietly acquired, dormant, intact, ready. Dormant assets aren't inactive, they're reserved. Add to that, a crisis PR firm retained months before the relationship became public, readiness, not reaction. The machinery was already built. Long before royal life, the infrastructure for managing global conflict was in place. And then came the detail that shattered coincidence entirely. In November 2015, nearly a year before the relationship went public, a private message was sent to a member of Prince Harry's protection team, hypothetical, polite, probing the difficulty of arranging an introduction. It went nowhere. It was logged later during a separate review. No motive assigned, just noted. But with that single entry, the mythology of chance quietly collapsed. By October 2016, MI5 finalized what it called a threat forecast. First phase, a surge of glowing media framing Meghan as a modernizing force, duration 18-24 months. Second phase, internal complaints, initially quiet, then persistent. Third phase, identity-based narratives foregrounded when strategically useful. Final outcomes, either a global scandal or a controlled separation converting status into leverage. The language was unemotional, the sequence was precise. The advice was simple: slow the relationship through administrative friction until interest cooled. None of it was followed. The briefing was delivered personally to the Queen. Marginal notes were made. Years later, one sentence would surface that explained everything. My grandson is lonely. One cannot vet for love. History weighed heavy. Politics intervened. Emotion overrode analysis. The file was sealed. The wedding went ahead. And the clock started ticking. The moment the file was sealed, the real gamble began. Because what happened next was not ignorance, it was containment. A quiet compromise stitched together behind palace doors, designed not to stop the risk, but to manage the blast radius once it inevitably arrived. By January 2017, a solution was agreed upon that never appeared in public announcements and never crossed a lectern. A prenuptial framework was quietly embedded into the Royal Marriages Act consent process. Financial exposure would be capped. Commercial fallout would be limited. And most crucially, any tell-all interviews in the United States were to be restricted for 15 years. In exchange, the wedding would go ahead, the institution would smile, the cameras would roll, and intelligence services would not disengage, they would observe. From that moment on, Prince Harry and Meghan Markle were not just newlyweds. They were a live intelligence environment. Permanent technical coverage of their communications was authorized. Not to interfere, not to intervene, simply to record. Terabytes of data accumulated quietly, stored far from palace corridors, far from press offices, far from anyone who believed this story was about romance. The Crown wasn't blind anymore, it was watching. The world, meanwhile, saw exactly what the forecast predicted. Phase 1 arrived right on schedule. Meghan Markle was framed as a revelation, a breath of fresh air, a symbol of progress, a force that would modernize an ancient institution. Magazine covers multiplied, headlines glowed, the word fairy tale was repeated until it lost meaning. And for a while, it worked. The monarchy basked in the afterglow, convincing itself that love had conquered caution. But beneath the polish, the second phase had already begun. Quiet complaints surfaced behind the scenes. Not dramatic, not explosive, just patterns. Staff turnover, emotional volatility, unpredictable reactions to perceived slights. Early echoes of behavior previously logged during television productions, now resurfacing inside palace walls. At first, these were dismissed as adjustment issues, cultural differences, pressure, stress. That denial did not last, because when pressure increases, patterns don't disappear, they accelerate. The file had warned that once admiration dulled, escalation would follow. And escalation did follow exactly as forecast. Identity narratives began to move forward, not as background context, but as primary leverage. Selective framing, strategic timing, moments chosen carefully, not impulsively. Each move widened the divide while preserving plausible deniability. By the time the public saw cracks forming, the internal damage was already structural. Then came the rupture. The separation wasn't sudden inside intelligence circles, it was expected. The only uncertainty was how it would be executed. The forecast had offered two endpoints: a global scandal or a controlled separation that preserved titles while converting status into commercial power. The second option won. Prince Harry left the United Kingdom not as a private citizen, but as a man still carrying royal branding. Meghan Markle left not diminished, but repositioned. California wasn't exile, it was headquarters. And the machinery that had been assembled years earlier, crisis PR, dormant digital assets, narrative control, was finally activated at full scale. The monarchy didn't just lose proximity, it lost containment. By 2021, the consequences were no longer theoretical. The institution was bleeding legitimacy across multiple realms. Commonwealth trust weakened, internal unity fractured. Prince Harry was estranged from his family, publicly and irreversibly. Meghan Markle held two titled children outside the United Kingdom and possessed the permanent ability to ignite a global media cycle with a single appearance, a single sentence, a single implication. Inside MI5, the Delta compartment that once held the original warning was quietly renamed. Lesson learned. Not because the threat was gone, but because it had been validated. Every phase of the forecast had materialized within the predicted window. Media elevation, internal collapse, identity leverage, strategic exit, commercialization of status. The timeline wasn't prophecy, it was analysis. And yet, even after all of it, the most devastating detail wasn't institutional, it was personal. Inside Windsor Castle, in a locked drawer, there remained a single photograph the Queen kept on her desk until the end. It showed Harry and Meghan on the palace balcony in 2018, smiling, radiant, still believing the story would end differently. On the back of that photograph, written in her own hand, were four words that never appeared in any briefing and never reached any headline: "I should have listened." Those words matter because they confirm what the public was never meant to know. This wasn't sabotage from the outside, this wasn't blindness, this was a choice. A choice to let love outrank intelligence. A choice to believe the institution could absorb anything. A choice to gamble centuries of stability against the hope that this time would be different. The file wasn't wrong, the forecast didn't fail, the system did. And that's why this story doesn't end with a wedding, a move, or a television interview. It ends with consequences that are still unfolding, quietly recorded, meticulously archived, and waiting for a future moment when the rest of the file no longer needs to stay sealed. Because once you know what was known before the fairy tale began, you realize the devastation wasn't unexpected. It was scheduled.